Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today we're going to get to have a great conversation with a friend of mine, a pastor, a leader, somebody who's challenged a lot of norms in the church, a guy named Mark DeYmaz. And I just am excited for you to meet him. If you've never heard of Mark, here's an innovative leader who has really lived out the things he then writes about. You know, a lot of times in writing and publishing, authors, you know, they have ideas and they talk about the ideas and they talk about the ideals, but they haven't always lived it out and in practice and then reflected back on it. Well, that's what Mark does in his life. And the topic, though, that we're going to dig into today is this idea that I think a lot of pastors, ministry leaders, even organizational leaders have to think about and contend with. And it's that idea of what happens when we just start living with and dealing with status quo. It's pretty easy to do that, right? Like all the rhythms and the ways in which we just do things become so normalized, almost like a liturgy, that we don't always question those things. We don't always ask the tough questions. Sometimes it's uncomfortable to press into those things. It's much easier to just let things go the way that they're going. And yet all of us know in leadership that there's times where things absolutely need to be disrupted. There needs to be change. There needs to be challenges. There needs to be people looking at the processes that people have just assumed were great and saying, no, that's not necessarily the best way forward. And so that's what Mark does. In addition to that, Mark has been on the forefront as a leader in the discussion around multi-ethnic churches, something that 30 years ago, maybe a few people were talking about it, but it had not become a major discussion throughout the church. And Mark's one of those pioneers who for years has just faithfully plugged away on that conversation and helping Christian leaders, pastors, especially those of white churches and white pastors who hadn't thought a lot about this, actually start to reconsider some things. I'll never forget being in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Mark lives, and one day we just went out and had lunch together, and it was over that hour and a half conversation that for me, he started to turn my own wheels about how do I think about multi-ethnic? How do I think about the idea of race and division that happens around that conversation? And this was many, many years ago, prior to seeing in American life how much now that has become a major source of frustration and divisiveness, and there's a huge lack of understanding. So when I look at people like Mark DeYmaz and the fact that we could have this conversation with them today, you're talking to somebody who's truly aligns and deeply is expressing the heart of God. He's been doing it for years. Before it was popular, before people wanted to talk about these things, he was talking about it. He was challenging other leaders personally to think about it, to go deep, to understand how the gospel calls us to be a reconciling community, and that our congregations, our churches should reflect what the kingdom of God looks like in every way. In addition to that, he's most recently released a book called Disruption, Repurposing the Church to Redeem the Community. And so I'm excited for us to just jump in and hear from him about really what is he sensing is the next moment for the church. What is the need for not only church leaders, ministry leaders, organizational leaders to really rethink some of the just long-held assumptions, and how do we do that well? So let's listen in on our conversation. Well, Mark, it is so great to have you as part of this conversation. And you and I have been friends for quite some time. And you've been such a great influence on me and my thinking, especially when you started building the multi-ethnic church movement, which was just one of many things you've done just to continue introducing you to people here on the Q podcast. You know, Mark planted Mosaic Church in Central Arkansas back in 2001, and he's still the directional leader there. But then in addition to that, started a whole network called Mosaics. And it's the global network that really helps so many many of the churches who've really started to pioneer and explore multi-ethnic churches. Mark is seen as the leader of that, and it couldn't be better timed. I know in 2001 when this was all beginning, Mark, just going back 16 years now, I mean, you knew that something was wrong within the evangelical church, within churches in general, Protestant churches just being so segregated, and you saw and felt a deep conviction to do something about it. But I mean, it's probably only in the last few years where it feels like there's been a total awakening to this challenge, and God was uniquely preparing you to lead in that. How do you look back over the last 16 years and sort of track just how that trend has changed and how people are now aware and awake and realizing this isn't just a trend or something cool that I need to do. This is actually the gospel, and this is what it means to do church faithfully.
Yeah, well, Gabe, first let me say thank you so much for having me on the Q podcast. It's always an honor to talk with you and be part of the Q family in whatever way that we can partner. And so again, thanks for having me. And yeah, I think, for such a time as this, right? I mean, 16 years ago, as you mentioned, there was a stirring in my spirit. It literally goes back 20 years to 1996, but that's another story. But all that's to say is I certainly wasn't the first. There were people back as early as Urbana in the 1940s, the Circle Church in Chicago in the 1960s, the late Ken Hutcherson in Seattle in the 1980s at Antioch Bible, other people like John Osteen, of course, Jim Cymbal at Brooklyn Tab. There were people that were outliers, as it were, in their ability, whether personally or through some measure of intentionality, to bring diverse people together to walk, work, and worship God together as one. In the 90s, of course, you have Erwin McManus or David Anderson or Sung Cha Ra, Ray Chang, just to name a few, in the mid-90s or so, that began to ramp it up and become more intentional. And it was really the book Divided by Faith, written by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith in 2000, that essentially launched a movement, as it were, with forerunners prior to that, and then pioneers like myself, right around the 2001, jumping in to be much more aggressive and intentional for the sake of the gospel, which I appreciate you bringing up. This is not about political correctness. This is about biblical correctness for the sake of the gospel, and a reformative movement really back to the way churches were in the first century, where diverse men and women beyond ethnicity, beyond economics, beyond gender, came together, rallied around the message of Jesus Christ. If he was lifted up, it drew all men, all women into himself. And this became the credible witness, the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven, beyond mere words that drew people to the cross and ultimately to the gospel. So when I look back over 16 years, certainly I see the trajectory that God was preparing not only me, but many others, and also the American church, to become much more receptive to this. I believe it's a sanctification of the bride. We talk about individual sanctification. The church collectively, at a local level and ultimately universally, should be pursuing a path of sanctification that ultimately takes us to Revelation 7:9, into a room, so to speak, where we walk, work, worship God together as one, where every nation, tribe, people, and tongue are there together, the bride of Christ sanctified. So if the kingdom of heaven isn't segregated, I long ago began to ask and try to address the question, why on earth is the local church? And given the last 3 to 5 years, the political climate, the cultural shift that we've gone through, winds have changed. And certainly this, in my opinion, should be the church's finest hour, where we step forth in a disruptive way to present a credible message of God's love for all people in an increasingly diverse and cynical society.
Yeah, there's no question it's getting more and more cynical, and some people are pulling away now and saying, I don't know if I have the energy to engage all these conversations, and you see the division kind of wearing people out. But I know you argue, look, as a church and as Christians, we don't get that option. We don't have the just sort of ignore things option. We're the ones that have to be leading, and I agree with you. The moment is ripe with opportunity right now. People are asking the big questions again. We're no longer just status quo, and your new book, Disruption, really gets at that, and it's perfect timing again, as usual with you. You're right on point with really speaking and having an insight that I think think the church needs to be aware of, listen to, and be a catalyst for how they can lead. But disruption, you describe how to repurpose the church to redeem the community. And so much of what we talk about at Q is this idea of how can the church, how can Christians within every channel of culture be a part of renewing their communities, their industries. And in this book, you make the case, but you say, look, disruption has to happen because status quo isn't working. Would you just describe for us and the listeners, what is status quo right now? Like, what are you seeing as kind of, and I know you see encouraging things on the front end, and we always do with sort of the innovators and some of the early adopters, but how would you describe status quo right now? And as you talk about disruption, where are you hoping the disruption could take people in the church, and why it's so critical to do that now?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, at a 30,000-foot view, Gabe, a metaphor to describe the status quo is this. I believe it's kind of like a sailboat, like where you're out and the sails are pitched and they're pitched for tailwinds. And for many, many years, for decades maybe, prior to the last 20, it certainly starts in 1960, but definitely in the last 10 to 20 years, the American church, the gospel boat, if you will, has had its sails pitched for tailwinds. But in our lifetime, the winds have shifted, and the American church is now sailing into headwinds. But the problem is the sails are still pitched as if it's 1990, and we're dead in the water in terms of advancing a credible witness of God's love for all people in this increasingly diverse and cynical society. I'm not a sailor, but I looked at sailing and wrote about it in this book. How do you keep a boat moving forward? If the boat is the gospel, how do you keep the gospel, the boat, moving forward when the wind is no longer at your back, when the wind is in front of you, when you're sailing into headwinds? And the maneuver in sailing is called tacking. It's tight zigzags back and forth along an imaginary straight line, quick adjustments into those winds to keep the boat going. And I think that's a metaphor that describes the American church. We have our sails pitched for tailwinds when the fact is the winds have shifted in our lifetime and we're sailing into headwinds.
Yeah,
so with that in mind, what does that look like? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, we continue as an American church to measure our success by numbers, dollars, and buildings. And the goal of most churches is to see souls saved, which I'm all about. But the point is, the way they go about it is measuring how quickly can we get to 200, 500, 1,000 people, building homogeneous churches that in terms of numeric look great, but in terms of influence actually undermine our credibility, because a church of 5,000 white people or 5,000 black people or 5,000 Korean people, what have you, systemically segregated churches, their influence is very limited in spite of their large numbers, because the people that attend those churches, by and large, live in the same neighborhoods, their kids go to the same schools, they run in the same social circles, they vacation in the same spots, they work in the same industries. And so, yes, it's a lot of bodies in a homogeneous church, but in terms of the pie of the community, which is like, let's say, a 10 or 12 slice pie, when they get out on a Sunday morning, they only go into 2 or 3 slices of the pie. When you have 300, 500 diverse people, politically diverse, ethnically diverse, economically diverse, that are walking, working, worshiping God together as one in a local church, your influence in the community is significantly greater than your numbers. Because when the people of that church leave on a Sunday morning, they go into 8 or 9 of 10 slices of a 10-slice pie, not just 2 or 3. So your influence is greater. And what I found is that so the systemic adjustment is moving away from merely creating homogeneous, spiritually minded churches that are focused on seeing souls saved, to adapting and thinking about what does it mean to save a community. And in terms of advancing salvation to an entire community, from which, therefore, we will actually see many more salvations across the board, because we're actually practicing Matthew 5:16, advancing not just good words, but good works, so that the light is shown on who God is and it attracts people to them. So I'll just finish with this. I know I'm a little bit long-winded on this, but there's so much to it. Think about a 3-legged stool. And there's three legs of the stool. The stool itself is community transformation, engaging the community in a credible way for the sake of the gospel. The American church, many American churches, certainly the white church in America, operates on a single leg. That's the spiritual leg. But again, they've created homogeneous churches. I'm arguing a disruption. We have to create churches that reflect the community, because how in the world are we going to transform a community if our church doesn't reflect it? But the second and third leg is social and financial. How do we aggregate justice? How do we advance social justice and compassionate ministry in a synergistic way in and through the local church? And not only that, but how do we leverage church assets to create economic transformation in local communities whereby jobs are created, crime is reduced, abandoned property is repurposed, tax revenues go up. And in all of that, there is that good work, but at the same time, it helps fund missions. So there are all these gospel types around the country who champion Jesus, but sometimes you want to ask them, where's your justice in all your Jesus? And then there's the justice types who are all about speaking truth to power, but sometimes you want to talk about where is your Jesus in all your justice? Very few people are thinking about economics. The disruptive model for the future is local churches operating on three legs of the stool, advancing a spiritual message through multi-ethnic churches that reflect the community, aggregating social justice through a development of umbrella nonprofits, and creating, on the third leg, for-profit, leveraging church assets to create for-profit ministry that blesses the community and helps to fund mission.
Yeah, and I think, as you push into that, it's innovative. A lot of pastors haven't heard of that. They're not thinking about that. They don't have teams that are thinking about that because they've been able to survive, like you said, with such a great tailwind, that thinking in these new modes of operation, I mean, you only do that when there's enough pain that you go, we have to change, right? Like you start to realize that the things we've been doing are not as effective. They're not reaching people. And if anything, in some ways, it's causing our own people, Christians, to become lethargic, to become cynical. As I think about this season ahead, I mean, Mark, have you been encouraged when you look at the cultural moment we're in right now, how divided things are? I mean, I know that seems odd that you'd be encouraged by it, but I feel like part of what I'm seeing is people are asking the bigger questions again, and they're not just stale anymore. Like, it might be rough, it might be hard to hear, it might be challenging, but a lot of big questions are being raised again, which is creating a new opportunity for the church to have a relevant voice into these conversations. And I'm sure there's frustration on your part that more churches aren't ready or prepared for that. But are you encouraged a little bit that the moment that we're living through right now is sort of demanding something more from the church than just status quo?
I think that's the latter part of what you said is what does give me encouragement. This is a golden opportunity for the church to be the church in the way it was in the New Testament, and once again move from the back of the line to the front of the line, because this entire country is crying out for peace, faith, hope, and love. We have the answer, but it's hidden. It's couched behind our homogeneity. It's couched behind the pursuit of success in all the ways that are not necessarily biblical. What I'm encouraged about is exactly what you said, Gabe, the opportunity that we have to speak into this culture. But the problem is, we are more like noisy gongs and clanging cymbals as we live in the status quo, as we keep our sails unfurled for tailwinds. People can't hear us because we often speak, for instance, only after problems of socioeconomics or political problems arise. We're not out front and on top on these issues, and that's largely due to the systemic segregation of the church and the pursuit of success by the wrong metric. So certainly I'm not encouraged with the fighting. In fact, I believe Christians today are more divided than the culture we live in. When Donald Trump was elected president, he gave a fiery inauguration speech that ticked off both conservatives and liberals alike, attacked both Republicans and Democrats. He went down Pennsylvania Avenue, went into his Oval Office, and signed some executive orders. Around his desk at the time, it wasn't just Republicans, it was Nancy Pelosi, it was Chuck Schumer. They were all having a good time. They were trading pens, joking, laughing about things in the moment. And what I realized is that in the political world, these people that will go out and attack one another on news or on the Senate floor or whatever, they will attack, they will push, they will be very vitriolic, and at the end of the day, they'll go have drinks. You know what Christians do, Gabe? They defriend each other. They defriend each other on Facebook, on Twitter. They get so mad and they get polarized, and the world is outliving us at a time when we should be outliving the world. This is a golden opportunity for the church to create churches, to re-engage culture by creating churches that reflect their communities, recognizing that justice is not peripheral to the gospel, it's intrinsic to the gospel, and advancing biblical justice through umbrella nonprofit work. And lastly, bringing economic transformation to communities in ways that blesses those communities and helps fund mission. If we do those three legs of the stool, I believe this could be the church's finest hour, and that's what gives me encouragement. This world is looking for hope and answers, and we have it, but it has to be shown through good works, not just good words. And I think that's where, by and large, the American church is missing it. We think we can teach our way and preach our way out of this mess and bring people together. I believe we're going to have to work our way out of this mess along the lines of Matthew 5:16, along spiritual, social, and financial fronts.
Yeah, that's good. Well, listen, in our final few minutes together, is there an example of the final point you make is the idea of churches somehow playing a role in this for-profit space, right, of contributing to their communities and investing? And for a lot of people listening, they probably think that sounds like a good idea, but have no idea of an example of that or a model of that. Could you just give us a story of where you've seen a church really have that kind of impact in a community, really in some ways beyond the typical imagination borders that most of us put around how a church can play a role in its city?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it begins really in the temple. Most churches do not want to make for-profit income because, first of all, they see themselves as a nonprofit, and they are. But the biblical verse that's cited is Christ overturning the money changers. What people have to realize is Christ wasn't against fair profit. He was against injustice when people are charging 5 times what a turtle dove is worth and preventing the poor from worshiping. So we have to understand that this was an issue of justice, not the fact that somehow Christ was against people making fair profit. Once you understand that and you see the condition of the community, then you can leverage church assets to bless the community financially by job creation, crime reduction, all those different things that we talked about earlier, and at the same time fund mission. Here's a very specific example. In 2012, we purchased as a church a 100,000 square foot abandoned property on 10 acres on one of the busiest intersections in the urban center of Little Rock, and therefore the state of Arkansas. And this former Kmart had been abandoned. It was an eyesore, prostitution, drugs, the works in the parking lot, gunfire going off, etc. We purchased the building not so much for the church, but for the community. And so what we did is a year later, we rented half the building to a major fitness club in Arkansas called 10 Fitness, $10 a month, no contract. I rented the space for $2 a square foot. That's nothing. $2 a square foot for 50,000 square feet. That club opened a year and a half later. Within 1 year, 6,000 people had joined in a community of 28% poverty. We brought the entire parking lot back to life. That $8,000 a month that they give to us in rent pays our $7,400 mortgage on the building. The owner invested $1.7 million in the building, and the building's value went from 1.5 to 4.2 over a 3-year period. It allowed me to borrow money from a bank, fix up our side, and currently on a $16,000 note, we collect $9,500 in rental income with still 18,000 square foot to rent. 30 jobs have been created. Crime has been reduced by 19% in a 1 mile square radius of the building. And I could go on about the economic impact to a community when a church repurposed an abandoned Kmart. We didn't go buy land and build new buildings. We practiced redemption in a community in a way that people could see. And this has led to the entree of the gospel to both liberals and conservatives, whether you're Christian or not, in our city. We've received awards. All these different things have happened. And I'm not saying that in a boasting way. This is Matthew 5:16. I'll just say one other thing. At a micro level, many years ago, I worked in a church of 150 people. I was the youth pastor. I came to that little church when I was finishing my Master of Divinity. And I went to that church. They had a parsonage, etc. And the budget for youth ministry was $50 a month. That's $600 a year. That's a lot of money in a little church and many churches. At Christmas time, I found out that our church spends $200 a month giving away free coffee on Sunday, hospitality. That's $2,400 a year. I realized that's a lot of money on our budget, and specifically for local churches around the country that are very small. $2,400 a year is a lot of money. So I took church assets, I blew out a wall, bought some tables, went and bought a couple waffle makers, I bought an espresso machine. I figured out that by going to Sam's Club, I could buy Jimmy Dean sausage biscuits for 12 of them for $10, 95 cents a biscuit. I created a $2 cafe in our church. You come, you want a waffle, $2. You want a cup of coffee, $2 as far as espresso. We still give free coffee, but you buy a biscuit, $2, etc. I figured out, and what we're doing is we're taking a $2,400 loss a year, still giving free coffee and turning it into a $2,400 to $4,800 profit in the year. If churches begin to think smart financially, this is going to position us for the disruption that's coming, because the government in our lifetime is likely to take away our tax-exempt status. That is likely to happen. And it can happen as fast as it takes to swear a president in and for them to sign an executive order. If that happens, tens of thousands of churches and perhaps tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs will be lost overnight as tithes and offerings are significantly reduced. The American church needs to think smart financially and position itself ahead of that disruption, but do it in a way that blesses the community in the examples that I'm talking to you about.
Yeah, these are great examples, Mark, and I appreciate you challenging us to think forward, to prepare for a future. And I think that's one of the unique things about the church. We've talked a lot about this at Q. You know, the church is this one place that brings all of these different channels of culture together, whether it's people in the media or arts and entertainment or business entrepreneurs or those in government and politics or the social sector, education. This is the one venue on a weekly or bi-weekly basis where you're pulling those kinds of leaders and people who are creating and operating in all those different spaces that touch everybody in the community. If pastors could start to get a vision for that and see how they can fuel that, and that those people aren't just there on a Sunday for spiritual nourishment, but that they're part of a body that's meant to be empowered to go out and work together, create together, collaborate, pool resources together, and go serve the common good of the people around them, I think we'll see amazing things happen. And so thank you for leading. Thank you for personally doing it practically in your own church, giving us those stories, but also writing about it. I think your books, this is your 6th book now, but your series of books have continued to push the church to be thinking ahead on this next step, and they many times become the textbooks for seminaries and the books that people hang on to because they know that they're in many ways timeless as you help communicate gospel ideas and principles into the practical of every day. So everybody listening, go out and get Disruption, Repurposing the Church to Redeem the Community. Mark, thank you for your work and your service, and thanks for being with us today.
You bet, Gabe. Thanks so much, and thanks for all that you do at Q.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed hearing Mark and his perspective. I hope it's challenged you. I know it's challenged me to reconsider some things that for a long time maybe I've just held on to or thought that's just the way things ought to be done. And the reality is, if we're not constantly pressing into that, if we're not constantly challenging the process and questioning ourselves and bringing others around us to help us rethink that, then sometimes we continue on these paths that really are well-worn, but not necessarily innovating in the way in which God might have called us. So I hope that challenges you. I also hope you'll go and get his book. You've heard a lot of the highlights, a few of the thoughts, but clearly there's so much more here than we could get into today. And so go out and get the book, Disruption, Repurposing the Church to Redeem the Community. At Q, we really believe the church is the hope of the world, that God's called us to be a part of renewing our communities, to restoring, as Isaiah 58 says, restoring the streets that we dwell in. This is a calling for the church. It always has been. And even though it might feel like that's getting a little more difficult, how can the church do it? I think there's incredible opportunity for us if we'll just see through these eyes and see through that lens. So until next time, we hope that you'll take these thoughts seriously. You'll be the kind of person that stays curious about the wonderful world we live in, that you'll think well, but that ultimately you'll go out and advance good and demonstrate for people an expression of the gospel, an expression of love for neighbor that maybe they've never experienced before, that makes these ideas so tangible. So have a great week, and until next time, I'm Gabe Lyons, and look forward to our next conversation.